Hi everyone and welcome to Simply Scuba. In this product breakdown we're going to be looking at your gauges. So you typically have 3 gauges on your instrument console or a combination of those 3 depending on what you want or what you need. So your gauges are your control panel and basically tell you everything that you need to know whilst you're on the dive, but with the increased availability of dive computers and dive computers increasing their features, analog gauges are slowly becoming a little bit redundant at times. The 3 gauges that you typically find will be your SPG, your submersible pressure gauge, your depth gauge, and a compass. Those are your 3 basic gauges, and they're typically in that order. So if you choose a single gauge, it will only have the submersible pressure gauge to tell you your tank pressure. Double gauges will have your tank pressure and a depth gauge, and a triple gauge will have a compass on the other end. So let's take a closer look at your gauges. Your SPG, or your submersible pressure gauge, connects to your high pressure hose and directly to the feed from your cylinder, so it shows exactly what is in your tank. Most are analog and use a board-on tube inside itself to show you the reading coming out of your tank and how much pressure is in your cylinder. So there are 3 basic types, but they all have the same screw fitting, which makes your life a lot easier. The cheapest are called compact gauges, usually something along those lines. These are the smallest, hence the name compact, and they definitely do the job. But one thing that you'll find is that they have a plastic front that can scratch quite easily, and they usually rattle if you kind of shake them from side to side, which can be quite disconcerting, but actually in most cases it's fine if there is a little bit of rattle, so don't worry too much about that. The better version is usually called a brass or a glass gauge. So these are larger and they have tempered glass fronts. These don't tend to rattle if you shake them around, which is a bit nicer, and they are a touch more accurate. So SPGs in general can have accuracies somewhere in the region of plus or minus 10% at times. So always consider that when you're looking at your gauges, because your gauge could be 10% higher or 10% lower than the actual correct reading, and you might have a lot less gas than you actually think you do. The third type of SPG is a digital pressure gauge. So these are quite new. They haven't been thoroughly tested yet, but they are definitely promising, and it is quite nice to see a digital readout instead of just glancing at a needle that eventually moves. So the face of the SPG will be round, with a needle in the middle which basically pivots, and then the gauge around the outside usually runs from 0 to 400 or maybe just 350 bar, or it'll run 0 to 5000 psi if it's an imperial gauge. The most we ever usually charge our tanks to is 300 bar, but it's good to have a gauge that can cope with sort of much more. You know that your gauge can go all the way up to 400 bar, even if it's never going to. Gauges on a submersible pressure gauge will be linear, so the distance between 0 to 50 bar will be the same as 150 to 200, and the last 50 bar will usually have a red color or some kind of indicator to let you know you're in your final 50 bar. The face of the gauge is usually white, and it will also glow in the dark as well if you shine a torch on it, but there is a rise in popularity of black-faced gauges with glow-in-the-dark numbers and needle instead, because on night dives when you shine a light on them, it doesn't blind you with the reflection if it has a black face. But you can still read a black-faced gauge even during the day and at night, so they are becoming a popular choice. Your depth gauge is very similar to your SPG, with a gauge around the outside and an analog needle in the center, but these aren't usually linear like an SPG. They can be, but nowadays they're not always. So the deeper you go, the closer the points will actually be to one another. The reason for this is so that when you're in shallow waters, the gauge is actually much more accurate and easier to read. Seeing the difference between 30 and 33 meters isn't so easy, but between 6 meters and 3 meters, where you want to do your safety stop, it's really obvious because the space is that much different. So you can see exactly what depth you're at for your safety stop. One thing that a lot of divers probably see but don't notice very much or do much about is the second needle on a depth gauge. Depth gauges have two needles, one that shows you the current depth that you're at and one that shows your maximum depth. Your maximum depth needle is it basically has a little hook on one end, and your current depth needle basically pushes on that the deeper you go. But when you start to shallow up, the maximum depth needle stays where it is and always points to the deepest you've been on that dive. So this is handy for working out your dive profile and filling out your logbook if your computer ever packs in, but it is important that you reset the needle after every dive. In the middle of the depth gauge will be kind of like a flathead screw or some kind of dial that you can turn so that you can reset that maximum depth needle. It is important to reset this after each dive because it can't reset itself. It can only be pushed up. If the needle isn't reset, then you may not actually know your actual maximum depth, and if there's an incident, the investigators will inspect your equipment and they'll look at that needle, and that needle may throw some confusion into their investigation. Some depth gauges will also have a screw on one side of them so that you can calibrate your depth gauge. You don't usually need to fiddle with these very often, but it can be nice to be able to if you know that your gauge is substantially wrong, so you can compare it with your dive computer at depth, and if you've got a flathead screwdriver on you, you can just adjust it a little bit. I've already spoken about compasses in this video up here, so I'm not going to go into too much depth about your compasses, but you can fit your compass to either the far end of your gauges, or you can have it on the front or the back, or just wherever you want. It just depends on the design, but traditionally your compass tends to be right on the far end, so you can see all of your gauges all in one straight line. You have a few choices when it comes to mounting your gauges. If it's a single gauge, you can just go naked and just have the SPG out, or you can fit a rubber protective boot that protects the gauges from bumps and scrapes. Some boots will have loops on them for attaching clips to give it a mounting point, but some brass gauges actually have mounting points built into their metal bodies to give it a really secure mounting point. Double check the diameter of your gauge, the size of your gauges if you're replacing a boot, because they can come in some different sizes. There is one sort of generic, but not always. You can find different sizes, so do be careful if you're replacing boots. Rubber boots are typically the most standard. They're pretty tough when they're cold because you don't want your gauges just popping out, but if you do warm them up in sort of near boiling water, the rubber will soften so you can pop your gauges in and out. So if you're ever struggling to try and get that sort of boot off, just dip it in some near boiling water and that should be enough just to soften it up so you can get your gauge out. Fixed plastic mounts are good because they're usually modular. All you need is a screwdriver or an Allen key or something to remove some bolts, and then you can add or remove sections as much as you like for a more custom set of instruments. With these, you also have the choice of fitting your dive computer to your gauges. Only if it fits, really, either by just replacing the depth gauge or both the depth and the pressure gauge. That's very much up to you. I prefer to have a analog backup gauge, but if you want a neat and compact setup, you can definitely save some space and some weight as well if you're traveling by fitting a dive computer to your gauges. It just makes it a little bit harder to change your regulators around, and you can't use your computer without those regs, and obviously you need to get a computer that is compatible with the mount. That's about it for gauges. Most divers, they start out with triple gauges because they feel they need everything, but they eventually just end up with a single gauge after a while because your dive computer does quite a lot of the things that the other gauges do, and your depth gauge is kind of redundant. And now with wireless transmitters as well, you don't even need a SPG if you don't really want one. You just need to trust your dive computer and the transmitter batteries implicably, and the programming as well. But What do you like to dive? Do you like to keep it minimal, just with a transmitter and nothing else? Or do you prefer sort of a long triple gauge with all of the info laid out in one place? Let's talk about your gauges in the comments below. If you like this video, then click that like button. If you want to see more, then of course click the subscribe button. If you didn't like this video, then hold down the like button even longer. The like button is dual function now. Anyway, thank you for watching, and of course, safe diving.